Hello, everyone. My name is Jean. I'm one of the members here at BTM. So for those who don't know, I'm a multimedia artist by profession. So I make mga graphic designs, videos, ganyan. And I think that will play a little bit into how do our presentation. Wait lang, hinahanap ko yung share. My gosh, bigla akong kinabahan kasi. Share screen, ayun. So there we go. And before we start, I'll give you a heads up that since Obadiah is a very short book of about 21 verses, we'll dive deeper into the historical aspect, the geography, and maybe a little bit of archaeology, so that we could really make the most out of understanding this book and what it really means. Ito kasi mabuhayan yung book when we read it. So, all right, let's start. So Obadiah is a brief prophetic book of the Old Testament that pronounces God's judgment against the Edomites, the ancient enemies of the nation of Israel. So they go way, way, way back, yung history nila with Israel. So that's why Edom has always been this rival nation since the very beginning. And we're going to dive into that very shortly. So we know that Obadiah is the fourth book of the 12 minor prophets, or the Ketuvim. It's the shortest book, as mentioned, with only 1 chapter and 21 verses. So it's a single unified prophecy against Edom that was probably spoken to various groups of Judeans to encourage them in the aftermath of their national tragedy. So at one point, Jerusalem or Judah was attacked by the Babylonians. So it was believed that the book of Obadiah was written to encourage yung mga Judeans or those who had been sent into exile. Moving on. So we know from reading the book of Obadiah that all parts of a doom oracle are present. So what are the 3 characteristics of a doom oracle? First is the announcement of doom, a prediction of Edom's coming defeat in verses 1 to 9. We see the reasons for doom, a review of Edom's crimes against his brother while Judah was helpless. That's in verses 10 to 14. And of course, as with most, if not all, of the prophetic books, there is a promised future for Jacob, not Esau. On the day of the Lord, Israel's sovereignty will be restored. By the way, Jacob is another way of addressing Israel, and Esau is another way of addressing Edom. More on that later. At the back, we have ancient ruins of the land of Edom, painted in 1700s or 1800s by Robert Moresby. Okay, now the author identifies himself as the prophet Obadiah, but this is all we know about him. So across the Old Testament, several Obadiahs have been mentioned. First would be Ahab's palace administrator, as mentioned in 1 Kings 8 verse 3. But this cannot be the Obadiah who wrote this book, because the Obadiah in 1 Kings lived about 200 years before the attack on Jerusalem. So we'll have to rule him out. And then there are other Obadiahs mentioned in Ezra and Nehemiah, which are roughly written around the same time frame. So, but it's unlikely that this is the same Obadiah. So none of these can be identified as the author of the book. On the right, we have a painting by David Bomberg called Hear, O Israel. It's a man clutching the Torah close to his chest. It's from the Jewish Museum in New York. But at least Obadiah's prophecy can be dated with greater certainty. As mentioned earlier, most scholars believe that the great humiliation of Israel, which the prophet mentions, was the siege of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, beginning in 605 BC and ending with its final destruction in 586 BC. Because we know from previous meetings in BTM that the Babylonian exile took place in phases, I think about 2 or 3. So anyway, the book must have been written shortly after the fall of the city, perhaps while the Israelites were still in captivity in Babylon. So that's what we have for the authorship and date. Now we move on to the historical setting, and bear with me because we are going to go way, 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 way back, as mentioned. At the back, we have an illustration of Jacob and Esau, with whom the story of the Israelites and Edomites begin. This was painted by James Tissot in 1836. It's from the Jewish Museum in New York. So we can trace their history to Genesis 25, verses 19 to 34. This is the very verse from which the conflict begins. And as we can read, it says here, "And the Lord said to Rebekah, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. One shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger." So just think about it. Even before Israel and even before Jacob and Esau were born, they were already predicted to be sworn enemies. God already told Rebekah that they were going to struggle against each other. And that will certainly reflect on when we read on to the book of Obadiah. So the book's condemnation of the Edomites is understandable when we consider the bitter feelings that had always existed between these 2 nations. So it began centuries earlier with the twin brothers, Jacob and Esau. They were rivals as siblings and eventually went their separate ways. So a little bit about the painting at the back. We have Jacob on the left. He's cooking a mess of pottage, lentil stew. Iba-iba siya sa different translations. But basically, he's cooking a red stew. And one day, Esau came home after a long day at a hunt. And then we can see him here on the right. He's usually depicted as somebody's hairy. He has hunting gear because he's a huntsman compared to Jacob, who was more of a homebody guy. So, ayun, what happened in this particular painting was that Esau came home from the hunt, and then he saw Jacob cooking a meal, cooking that lentil stew. And then he said, "Give me some of that stew." And then Jacob refused, but then he said, "Okay, but you're going to give me your birthright in exchange for this stew." And what happened was that Esau agreed. So isipin mo, he traded his blessings for a bowl of stew. That's the worst deal in the history of all deals ever. And so that was how Esau lost the favor of his father Isaac. So I also believe that we need to dive deeper into the meaning of the word Edom to understand the full context of the history. So the word Edom is derived from the word Adom in Hebrew, which means red. So why is this important to our study of the book of Obadiah? So it's worth noting that Esau was born as the red and hairy twin, as mentioned earlier in Genesis 25 verses 25. And number 2, he exchanged his birthright for Jacob's red stew. Yun nga yung nakwento natin earlier. That's in Genesis 25 verses 29 to 34. And third, Edom, or present-day Jordan today, is known for its red rock formations, one of which being Petra or Rose City, and its ancient copper mines in Timna Valley and Kirbat and Nahas. So we can see even from the very landscapes that it's all red, and even their copper mines, as we know, from which they harvested copper, were also red. So there's really a lot into the word Edom. So it plays into how we should study the book of Obadiah. So at the back, we have a painting called Esau Going for Venison, or an illustration. And we see his father Isaac telling him to go hunt and prepare a meal so that I could bless you. But what happened there was that Rebecca, his mother, overheard them talking, and then at the end of the day, si Jacob yung si Jacob yung nakakuha ng blessing ni Isaac. He tricked him by pretending to be Esau. Next. Again, more illustrations. Again, another one of Isaac and Esau on the left, similar to the last illustration. And usually, Esau is depicted as having red hair or red skin. It's never really clear in the Bible what they mean when they say that Esau was red. So usually he's depicted with red hair or reddish skin, in addition to his hunting gear. And then on the right, we have a photo of Petra City. This monument is specifically called the Treasury. So it's a World Heritage Site as proclaimed by UNESCO. It's like a really, really amazing structure. Just to clarify that this was not carved out by the Edomites. This was carved by the people who had conquered the Edomites, the Nabateans. Pero just to give you an idea of where the Edomites might have lived in before the Nabateans took over. So isipin mo, this is like one huge structure carved into the side of a mountain, and it survived the test of time, the weather, rains, earthquakes, because it's situated in such a way na nakatago siya in between mountains. So this part of Petra City was really well preserved. And I imagine that there are parts in the mountains that that would have served as refuge also for the Edomites. So that's why I brought this up, so that it would give you an idea of what to imagine when we read the book of Obadiah. So let's move on to the verse Deuteronomy 2 verses 12, which would give us a better idea again of the history of Edom. So the Horites also lived in Seir formerly, but the people of Esau dispossessed them and destroyed them from before them and settled in their place, as Israel did to the land of their possession, which the Lord gave them. So we know from this verse that Esau's descendants settled south of the Dead Sea and became known as Edomites. They conquered Horites, which interestingly from the etymology is sometimes translated as cave dwellers who dwelt in the hill country of Seir. That's from Genesis 14 verses 1 to 6 and Deuteronomy 2 verses 12. So at one point, the descendants of Esau conquered those who lived in Seir, and judging from the etymology of the word, I think we could have a better idea of how the Edomites might have lived. Maybe they lived in those caves that the Horites used to live in. Pero typically kasi, the Edomites were known to be a nomadic people. So that's just one of the places where they might have lived in. Some of them also lived in the desert then. So here on the left, we have a cave in Petra, Jordan, which we know is Edom. More images of Petra, Mount Hor, and Akba. So this is the Petra mountain ridge, or Mount Seir as described in Genesis. And in the middle, we see, if I'm not mistaken, that's the monastery, which is part of Petra City, not to be confused with the monument that we saw earlier. So as you can see, it's a really rough and mountainous terrain. And this is the kind of environment that that the Edomites might have lived in. Here we have people standing around Petra. So the Edomites, again, lived all across Edom, of course. Pero this is one of the sites called Petra. Well, it's called Petra today. But anyway, this city is accessible only by going through the Seir. Now, the Seir is a 1.5 kilometer walk before reaching Petra City. So, as you can see from the photo, it's a very, very narrow path going into Petra. And that's only mga 2 to 3 meters wide. And it's very high, about 80 meters or 200 feet high. So that's the kind of canyon that they would have to pass through to reach the city. Now, okay, this is only my imagination lang. Pero if the Edomites really had lived here prior to the Nabateans, I would imagine that this walk, this 1.5 kilometer walk was something that that might have served as something like a funnel or a reverse funnel. So if imagining lang natin that if anyone tried to attack the city of Petra, they would have to go through that 2 to 3 meter wide canyon. So that's not much space, especially if you're leading thousands of armies. So it's very, we can see from here that Petra is very inaccessible, diba? And according to one of the resources that I also checked into, if there were horses or maybe camels that were going through this canyon, rinig na rinig sila. It would echo all across that canyon. So of course, I've never been to Petra myself. So take this with a grain of salt. It is only my imagination. Pero I would imagine that that if anyone at all tried to go to Petra City, like a foreign invader or whatever, parang maybe the Edomites might have been easily alerted by that just from the sounds, because it's very loud. So you can see that how the terrain might have worked to their advantage. But of course, that's just my imagination. I don't know what happened back then, pero we'll see. Again, we have more Petra Jordan caves, which the Edomites might have lived in. And even today, present-day residents of Jordan, or at least some of them, yung mga Bedouin tribes or mga nomads, they would live in caves. So I think there's reason to believe that that the Edomites might have lived that way also. Though just to clarify, I also read sources where some of the caves might have been carved by the Nabateans then. So I don't know which is which. But at least it will give you an idea of how they might have lived. Okay, and here we have a photo of one of Edom's copper mines. So there are several sites all across Edom for mining copper. And this is one of the larger ones called Kirbat and Nahas. So it's one of the largest copper mining and smelting sites in the ancient world. Large quantities of copper was processed as early as 9th century BC. So before, there was some debate among the archaeologists if Edom even had that kind of advancements. But according to radiocarbon dating of the charcoal below this building and yung mga waste products in the copper production, it all goes back to the 11th or 12th century. So even way, way, way before the invasion of Jerusalem, even during Solomon and David's times, they already had this kind of technology. So isipin nyo, in the ancient world, if you had control of if you had this kind of technology, if you knew how to wield iron or bronze or copper, that shows how advanced you were. And of course, it serves as a tactical advantage then in terms of military. And the site is so huge. So it's suggested by archaeologists that this was not only for local production of copper, they also exported to other countries like Egypt or maybe Greece. That's how powerful Edom was and how huge their economy might have been. The source is Biblical Archaeology Review. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the Edomites at this point. So what about Jacob? What about Israel? So we know that Jacob's descendants settled farther north, eventually developing into the covenant people known as the nation of Israel. So the Bible reports many clashes between these two factions. So another point of contention, or another point where the Edomites and the Israelites had clash over was during the Exodus. So at one point, the Israelites were in a site called Kadesh Barnea, that's somewhere in the left of Edom, or right below the Dead Sea, I think. So somewhere here. And then Moses sent men to the king of Edom asking if they could pass through the nation, and they promised not to touch anything or what. Pero the king of Edom refused. So that is one of the things that they had bad blood over. So they were not able to pass through Edom to go to the promised land. So next. And here are some notable mentions of Edom and Esau throughout the Old Testament. We have the enmity between Jacob and Esau, as already mentioned earlier. Excuse me. Esau and his family settles in the hill country of Seir, away from Jacob. There was a point in time where Esau and Jacob met together, and they supposedly were on good terms, but eventually, they still fought after that. Their family still fought after that. It came to a point that Esau's cattle became so big, and his family became so big, and as well as his possessions, that he had to move to the hill country of Seir, away from Jacob. That's in Genesis 36 verses 6 to 8. And 3, Israel was denied passage through Edom from Kadesh, as mentioned earlier in Numbers 20 verses 14 to 20. Next, we have Saul fighting Israel's enemies, including Edom. They were mentioned in 1 Samuel 14 verses 47 to 48. And number 5, King David had victory over 18,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt and established garrisons in Edom. And as the archaeology has suggested, some of them thought that maybe this was a point of interest for King David, because if you had control of copper, that would make you a very powerful nation. So it was that way between Israel and Edom for the next few kings. So King David had rule over Edom. King Solomon also had rule over Edom, where he built a fleet of ships in Esion-Geber, near the Gulf of Aqaba, in the land of Edom. That's in 1 Kings 9 verses 26. Next, eventually, the Edomites revolt from the rule of Judah and gained their independence, as mentioned in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. And of course, we have multiple prophecies made against Edom, as mentioned in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Joel, Amos, and of course, finally, we have the book of Obadiah, where he made a final prophecy that Edom would be destroyed because they participated in the looting of Israel after its fall. So when the people of Judah were exiled, they took delight in that. Parang natuwa sila. So they looted Jerusalem. Archaeologists also suggested that some of them even settled in the ruins of Jerusalem or Judah. Next. So for your violence against your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever. That's from verse 10 of Obadiah. Scholars suggest that Edomites were destroyed by the Nabateans or pushed out of their land a few centuries after Obadiah's prophecy. So yun, so if there were any Edomites that might have survived, they already assimilated with the Judeans and they lost their identity as Edomites. So essentially, either way, they were destroyed or they were gone. Their house was completely gone, as written. Okay, now we move on to the structure of the book of Obadiah. There are predictions of judgment on Edom. That's verses 1 to 9. The reasons for judgment on Edom. That's verses 10 to 14. The results of judgment on Edom. That's verses 15 to 16. And finally, the possession of Edom by Israel. At the back, we have another photo of the desert in Jordan. This one is called Wadi Rum. So what's the purpose of the book of Obadiah? Number one, it's to show that God judges those who have harmed his people. And number two, to show that God humbles the proud. At the back, we have a picture of the monastery in Petra City. It's like the farthest point, I think, from the entrance to Petra City. So I think that's way up in the mountains now. Unique features of the book of Obadiah. So we already know that Obadiah is the shortest book in the Old Testament. And interestingly, it's the only prophetic book directed against a foreign nation without any oracles of judgment against either Israel or Judah. So this is what really sets the book apart. It's that it's solely focused on the Edomites and their destruction. And interestingly, verses 1 to 9 of Obadiah and Jeremiah 49 verses 7 to 22 express essentially the same idea. So many of the words and phrases in these two passages are exactly alike. Some scholars believe that Jeremiah drew from the Obadiah passage to emphasize God's impending judgment of Edom. So if that's true, we could see how Jeremiah took the book of Obadiah very seriously, as short as it was. Even though it was 21 verses, he thought it was worth writing into his own book. So yes, and he's one of the greatest prophetic figures in Israel's history. Okay, now we move on to special considerations when we read the book of Obadiah. Of course, we know that the primary genre is prophecy. Number two, the predictions of the future are couched in oracles of judgment and an oracle of salvation or deliverance. Number three, the oracles of judgment against Edom are examples of satire with discernible objects of attack and a satiric norm by which Edom and other nations are criticized. On the right, we have verses 3 to 4 of Obadiah. The pride of your heart has deceived you, you who live in the clefts of the rock, in your lofty dwelling, who say in your heart, who will bring me down to the ground? Though you soar aloft like the eagle, though your nest is set among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. So as we've seen from the previous slides, we've seen what Edom must have been like. We saw that it was a very high terrain and that they probably lived in caves or clefts of the rock. And that was a source of their pride because it kept them safe. More on that later. But keep this verse in mind when we revisit the mega themes. Specific advice for reading. So Edom was Israel's most tenacious foe throughout the history of the two brother nations. And because of that, it should come as no surprise that Edom is the subject of more foreign nation oracles than any other people. We've seen Edom mentioned all across the Old Testament and in multiple prophetic books. And that's really not surprising given yung tensions that have always existed between them since Jacob and Esau. So they have a lot of vendetta going between them. So they were brother nations that fought, and so it's no surprise, that so much of the prophecies was about Edom. The principles for reading any foreign nation oracle apply here. Yahweh is God not only of Israel, but also of all the nations of the world. It reflects the curse side of the Abrahamic covenant, or I will curse those who curse you. It is the prophet's engagement in the holy war as a divine messenger of the divine warrior. If Israel's sins are great and deserve punishment, the treachery of Edom will also be punished, since it stands so completely over against God's own character of generosity and kindness. So if God is to deliver his people completely and permanently, he cannot leave their enemies free to strike again. Here you find the typical final eschatological backdrop against which temporal judgments are to be understood. So this is another fact, or this is another point that I got from Dr. Tim Mackey of the Bible Project. Interestingly, Edom also uses the same letters that spell out humanity. As we've discussed earlier, the word Edom is derived from the word Adom, and of course, that sounds a lot like Adam, or humanity. So this might explain the shift in verse 15 from Edom to God's eventual judgment of all nations that have acted like Edom. In verse 15, it says, "For the day of the Lord is near upon all the nations. As you have done, it shall be done to you. Your deeds shall return on your own head." So keep in mind that when we think of nations that hate Israel, Edom is the very prime example, given yung naging history nila. So if there was any nation or any peoples at all that hated Israel the most, it was the Edomites. And interestingly, it's also, the word Edom can also be used to spell out the word humanity. So in a way, we can also read this as God judging not only the nations who hate Israel, but God judging all of humanity. You may also want to read Psalm 137 alongside Obadiah to capture the sense of how deeply Israel felt about Edom's treachery. And as mentioned, Obadiah has passages that sound similar to Jeremiah 49 verses 14 to 16 and 49 verses 9 to 10. Now we move on to the key verses of Obadiah. So 9 to 10 reads, "Your warriors, O Teman, will be terrified, and everyone in Esau's mountains will be cut down in the slaughter. Because of your violence against your brother Jacob, you will be covered in shame. You will be destroyed forever." Just to clarify things, Teman is one of the descendants of Esau, as listed in the book of Genesis. Okay, and I think we've already tackled verse 15, so I will move on to the next slide. Now we moved on to verses 17 to 18. "But on Mount Zion will be deliverance, it will be holy, and the house of Jacob will possess its inheritance. The house of Jacob will be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame. The house of Esau will be stubble, and they will set it on fire and consume it. There will be no survivors from the house of Esau. The Lord has spoken." On the right, we have an illustration of Jerusalem from Mount Zion, illustrated in 1849. Okay, from what I understand of this verse, and from what we know of Edom so far, we can see that they put their pride on the mountains of Seir in which they lived, and it worked to their own advantage, to their protection. It kept them safe. They took pride in that. They saw it probably as their deliverance. But Obadiah is telling us here that we don't look, that on the contrary, we will look on a different mountain. So we will look on Mount Zion for deliverance. So why Mount Zion? We know that the temple is there. So that's one of the reasons why it's called the Temple Mount. And so we know now that it is where Jesus will eventually reign. And because Jesus came from the house of Jacob, so God is telling us that we are to put our faith not just on any mountain, but on him and him alone, from which he will rule forever. Now we move on to the mega themes. First is justice. Obadiah predicted that God would destroy Edom as punishment for standing by when Babylon invaded Judah. Because of their treachery, Edom's land would be given to Judah in the day when God rights the wrongs against his people. God will judge and fiercely punish all who harm his people. We can be confident in God's final victory. He is our champion, and we can trust him to bring about true justice. And as we know, God will reign, and God reigns forevermore. And that is why we look onto Mount Zion. Next on the mega themes is pride. Because of their seemingly invincible rock fortress, the Edomites were proud and self-confident. But God humbled them, and their nation disappeared from the face of the earth. All those who defy God will meet their doom as Edom did. Any nation who trusts in its power, wealth, technology, or wisdom more than in God will be brought low. All who are proud will one day be shocked to discover that no one is exempt from God's justice. So we know from the previous slides, and we've known from what we've discussed so far, that Edom was really proud of where they lived. They lived up high in the mountains. They made their nests above like eagles, as Obadiah had wrote. And it was, in a way, a symbol of how proud they were. And the mountains also served as a tactical standpoint. And we already discussed some of them earlier, like ayun nga, it's a unique terrain. Right? You had to walk a long way just to get to the city. So it made it very secure, and I imagine it would be hard to invade. Number two, they were on higher ground, and in seeing it from a military tactical standpoint, when you're on higher ground, you can see the enemies even before they come. And it's also easier to attack enemies from a higher position. So that's why the Edomites might have also seen the mountains of Seir as a source of their pride, because they lived in a very secure place. And we can see also that there are areas in Mount Seir, like this one, for example, where they were very safe from the elements. So even though there were winds or maybe some rain, they were safe and they were secured. That's how the monument at the back was very well preserved. So I imagine that there are some parts of Edom or Mount Seir that was very safe. Like even if earthquakes strike, they were still safe. But even then, even though they had that, even though they had their technology with the copper, even if they had their lively economy because of their trades with different countries, at the end of the day, they defied God, and God allowed them to meet their doom, and he brought them down to the ground, because no one is exempt from God's justice. Okay, we move on to theology. So we see from the book of Obadiah that the lordship of God encompasses the book, as well as his sovereignty over all humanity, or Adom. God shows his justice by calling people, even pagan Edom and the nations, to account for their hurtful actions against his chosen nation. The Edomites are specifically singled out due to their kinship relationship with Israel, which should demand support rather than opposition. And we know that they were brother nations, Israel and Edom, but the irony here is that they became the most bitter of enemies. While Israel's punishment through defeat and exile is justified since they broke their covenant with God, as listed in Deuteronomy and 1 Kings, God's grace and faithfulness to his own covenant obligations toward Israel lead him to restore them. So we see that God is very much faithful to his promises. God does not make a blanket permanent judgment of punishment on the nations, but makes judgment or blessing dependent on their response to God and his people, as mentioned in verse 15. The time for this judgment is the day of the Lord. This day is a final eschatological event when the faithful are blessed, but sinners are punished, as mentioned previously in the books of Joel and Amos. Prior to this culminating event, there are also times of judgment throughout Israel's history, anticipatory days of the Lord. So now we know all this about the book of Obadiah. How do we find Jesus in this book? How do we see his, what kind of foreshadowing is there? Or how do we look at this book through Jesus' lens? So in Jesus Christ, the prophecy of Obadiah comes to pinpoint focus. In Obadiah, God's people are being oppressed by their own relatives. Jesus came to that which is his own, but his own did not receive him. John 1 verses 11. Instead, his own relatives mocked him, regarded him with contempt, mistreated him, handed him over to be executed. Exactly what the Edomites did to the people of Judah, because even they looted Judah when it fell. Jesus did not take matters into his own hands when he was mistreated, but rather waited patiently for God to avenge the injustice. So actually, even didn't Roman soldiers also fight over or gamble over Jesus' garments? So something like that. Jesus also experienced being looted. So when they hurled their insults at Christ, Christ did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. As he promised in the prophecy of Obadiah, God avenged himself on those who dare do such a thing to this representative of his people. Even more, in one act of vengeance, God unleashed his full punishment on everyone who had or ever would set themselves against him. But the one who would bear the judgment was the only one who didn't deserve to. Jesus bore the vengeance of God against Edom's sin, against humanity's sin, Edom, against our sin. By satisfying God's vengeance, Jesus provides the way of deliverance for prideful, arrogant, and inhumane people like us. God shows that his vengeance has been satisfied by raising Jesus from the dead. When we put our faith in Jesus, his experience of divine vengeance becomes ours too, and we die with him on the cross. Together with him, we are raised to new life, no longer as enemies of God, but as belonging to his own people, for whom God will one day right all injustice. And to add from earlier, Jesus, who is from the house of Jacob, will reign over Mount Zion and over the rest of the world, over all of humanity. Okay. Thank you so much. Those are the references. As you can see, there's a lot. And these are video references that I also look into, that you might also want to look into if you've enjoyed this presentation. So mostly it's videos on the Edomites, biblical Edom, overviews of Obadiah, present day Petra or Jordan. So those kinds of resources. Images used, that's a lot. And as an addition, we have a really short visual exegesis of our cover of the presentation. So knowing what we know right now, this is based on Obadiah 1 verses 3 to 4. And as we see, it's clearly based on these verses. The pride of your heart has deceived you, you who lived in the clefts of the rock. We already know that the Edomites lived in the mountains of Seir or Petra. They might have lived in caves. So this on the left is an image of Petra. Who say in your heart, who will bring me down to the ground? Though you soar aloft like the eagle, though your nest is set among the stars, because they lived in a very, very high place. From there, I will bring you down, declares the Lord. On the right again is the painting by David Bomberg, which reminds me of Obadiah in terms of its color scheme, because it's all reds and oranges. But that's me and my art history side talking. All right, that's it. Thank you so much. I'm thankful that you've joined me and you've invited me to talk about this. And I hope that you've learned a lot about the book of Obadiah, as short as it is. Even if it's only 21 verses, we know and we see that if we look and dig deep, if we dig deep as the Edomites have done, digging for copper, we would unearth this kind of treasure. It's a very substantial book, unsuspectingly, and I hope that you enjoyed this. Thank you so much, and thank you also to the rest of Tribe Aletheia, and I think also Sir Dance also contributed to the research of this. Thank you so much for making this possible. Yes, enjoy.